Hello, YouTube. Today I would like to discuss a topic called rock artists, rock bands who changed their genres throughout their careers. Every single, basically most rock bands do that, but these ones are made a dramatic change in the style from what they started with. Okay, let's get this list started. First up is Darius Rucker. Darius Rucker is best known as the lead vocalist of the bands Hootie and the Blowfish. Hootie, with Hootie and the Blowfish, they were known for their country rock or alternative rock genre, or with elements of pop and folk. And in 2002, Darius Rucker released his first solo album, which had a real soul and R&B sound to it. And in late 2008, Hootie and the Blowfish disbanded, and Darius Rucker began his solo career and became a major country star. A decade after Hootie and the Blowfish had disbanded, they reunited and released an album which is more which sounds a lot similar to the style of Darius Rucker's solo country career that he did for much of the decade. Next up is Kid Rock. Kid Rock started off as a pure rapper. Believe it or not, his first studio album was released in 1990, and then he released his breakthrough album, Devil Without a Cause, in 1998, which established his signature rap rock sound, blended with elements of southern rock and country. Then a few years later, he moved even further into the sounds of country music with ditched hip hop, ditched rap music entirely. In the beginning of the 2010s, Kid Rock was exclusively made country his primary genre. Next up is the Bee Gees. The Bee Gees started off as a mellow psychedelic pop folk rock band, and they were very similar to the Beatles. The Bee Gees had formed in 1958, but it was only nearly a decade after that they formed when they released their first studio album. In the mid-late 70s, the Bee Gees became successful as a disco act, and then in the early 80s, they moved away from disco towards just soul and R&B. Next up is the Byrds. The Byrds, you may think of the Byrds primarily as a folk rock band. Well, yes, they started off as folk rock. Then a few years and albums into their career, they blended their folk rock sounds with elements of psychedelic rock, and then in the late 60s they became focused more with country and country rock. Next up is Iggy Pop. Well, unlike most acts on this list, Iggy Pop has never really changed his genre after his rise to fame. But, 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 however, before the Stooges had formed, Iggy Pop had a career in blues, and then the Stooges began, and then he got famous in the late 60s with the Stooges, but with their signature garage rock and protopunk sound, which Iggy Pop was also known for with his extensive successful solo career that he began just right after the Stooges had disbanded. I mean, sure he has changed genres from time to time and moved away from rock and punk, but that was his primary genre. He particularly moved away from the genre with, in the late 2000s, doing singing in French and doing more jazz and cabaret style music. Next up is the Beastie Boys. Like with the prior example, the Beastie Boys were originally a heavy hardcore punk band that they formed in the late 1970s, and before the release of their debut studio album, the Beastie Boys were known as a hardcore punk band. But that was before they had even rose to true worldwide fame and stardom. With the release of their 1986 studio album, Licensed to Ill, they became known for the hip hop band that the world knows them for today. Next up is the Moody Blues. The Moody Blues released their debut studio album in 1965. They were, of course, at the time when they first started, they were known as a blues and R&B band, and considering the word blues being in their band's name. Then with the late 1960s, with just a few years and after one album in, they became known for their symphonic progressive rock sound, which and they were kind of like a prototype for bands notably like Electric Light Orchestra. They were kind of like a predecessor band to them. Next up is Eddie Vedder. Eddie Vedder is basically primarily known as the lead vocalist of Pearl Jam. Pearl Jam themselves have even changed genres throughout their career. They started off as grunge with their first two studio albums. Then with their third album was a transitional album, moving away from the grunge from their early grunge roots towards a more experimental alternative rock sound that the band fully embraced on with their fourth studio album, and got even more experimental as the decades had moved on. In 2011, Eddie Vedder released a solo album in the folk genre, and the album features his skills on the ukulele, and that album ditches alternative rock or even rock in general entirely. Next up is Steven Tyler. Steven Tyler may be primarily known as the lead vocalist of Aerosmith, and like with most bands out there, Aerosmith themselves as a band were even known to change genres. Aerosmith started off as a more bluesy hard rock band, and were comparable to bands like Led Zeppelin and the Rolling Stones, especially the latter. In the late 80s, Aerosmith made a successful comeback after years of all the five members abusing drugs and alcohol and other substance abuse. They started anew. The bands reinvented themselves and moved towards their more radio friendly rock sounds, which at first blended elements of 80s glam metal. And later on, beginning in the 90s, they were infamously known for those poppy commercial ballads. At that point, the band also began working with outside songwriters. In 2016, Steven Tyler released his debut solo album, and the album with his first solo album, Steven Tyler moved into country and ditched hard rock or even rock in general entirely. And finally, last but not least, David Bowie. David Bowie is probably the rare rock artist that was known to switch genres from one album to another, from one era to another. Early on in his career, he started off with his first studio album was released in 1967. It had a real 60s British pop sound to it, with elements of music hall. And then his second studio album was folk rock. His third studio album was heavy metal. His fourth studio album, he moved into the glam rock phase that he became famous for with his band The Spiders from Mars and that's when he put on his Ziggy Stardust persona. Then in the mid 70s, he moved to funk, and in addition, that was when he used his Thin White Duke persona. Then in the late 70s came his so-called Berlin trilogy, where he blended krautrock mixed with post-punk. At the start of the 80s, he moved towards a more mainstream post-punk sound mixed with new wave and occasional hard rock elements. Then in the early 80s, he reemerged with a successful 80s pop rock sound, and although the success really lasted for the first album of that era. And then at the end of the 80s, he formed the band Tin Machine, and Tin Machine was a primary hard rock band, was a pure hard rock band. Then in the early 90s, he moved to soul, dance, and R&B. Then in the mid 90s, he moved to industrial and electronic, which lasted well through the early 2000s, where he switched to mainstream alternative rock. Then came a decade-long retirement from David Bowie, and in 2013, not long before his death, he made a comeback, and his final studio album, which was released on his 69th birthday, and only 2 days before his death, he had an avant-garde jazz and progressive rock sound. His final studio album was recorded just a year before he died, and that was an attempt at, even by the near the end of his life, he still proved that he could make great albums and be as relevant as he was back in the 70s. Well, anyway, that wraps up the list. Please rate, comment, and subscribe. Hope you all liked my video. Thank you.